Hello and welcome to our low carbon conversation series where we bring together leading thinkers and influencers in the commercial property sector. And today I'm really delighted to be joined by two fabulous guests, Will and Matteo, who are going to delve into the world of EPDs with us. Will is a managing director at Forza doors, and you're here to talk to us today because we've been in conversation for quite a while now about your new EPDs, which I think are the first door EPDs to come out in Europe.
First timber doors in the UK, yes, exactly.
Very
excited.
exciting. And Matteo, again, more trailblazers, but in a different part of the industry. Daikin have begun the process of EPDs throughout the whole of their product portfolio, but you've started with a specific set of products. Do you want to begin by just introducing what products are covered by the EPDs?
Yeah, sure. Produced? And by the way, thanks for having us today. It's great to have this kind of conversation and share more about the journey on EPDs in general. So we specifically started with a product we call VRV, which other manufacturers may refer to as VRF as the generic technology, but the reason for going for that specific product is it is effectively, let's call it the crown jewel when it comes to commercial applications from an HVAC point of view. You got one in this very room where we are. I was very pleased to see when I walk into the room. Absolutely, I always do. That comes with the job. Wherever you go, you look up. So because of how widespread they are in all sort of buildings, not just around the UK but around Europe, it made sense to start with that one because we knew that we could immediately deliver something very, very useful for the industry. Not just for new construction, but also for refurbishment and upgrade of existing building, where you may be deciding to use this type of technology. And so we knew that we wanted to quickly give access to a wealth of data that someone like Overbury could use to decide where to go for their next project, for example. And just very quickly in terms of what a VRV is, for those who are not 100% familiar with, it is fundamentally, think of it as a sort of a Lego type of system. You can combine together lots of different standard pieces together. It's a very flexible system that allows you to do space heating, space cooling. You can also do a portion of domestic hot water. And you would have a component outside on the roof and then a selection of indoor units inside different rooms, like again, one we have in this very room. And then you have refrigerant that flows between all the different components. And I'm sure we'll talk more about refrigerant because it is for us in our sector of the industry is a key component that we need to consider and then we are doing a lot of research on.
Will, do you want to tell us which products you chose to cover and why you selected those particular products?
Yeah, of course. So Forza is a timber products manufacturer, predominantly doors and frames. We do some screens and some other products as well, but really the core of our business is around doors and frames, and that's where we focused at the beginning of this EPD journey that we're on. So the way that we kind of try to capture the most of our sales and the volume that we do, we produce 6 EPDs that cover 4 of which cover doors, depending on the fire rating that they have, those what the products, or also depending on whether they're glazed or unglazed. So try and give that flexibility for the end user, and then it's kind of same as Matteo said, it's kind of that Lego brick kind of approach, and you can kind of then slot it in as needed. And then we also looked at the frames as a separate product, and we did a further 2 EPDs there, again, depending on the fire rating, so FD30 or FD60. So that's where we are at the beginning of the journey, but there'll be more to come as we continue to invest into it.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic to see you guys investing in it. How did you actually start that process of actually finding the EPD verifier and consultant, and how did you find that process of selecting somebody to help you on that journey?
Yeah, I think one of the early conversations we had was probably with yourself, and I think you suggested a couple of potential areas where we could gain support. We went out into the market. It was a completely new approach and process to us, so it was really critical for us to find a partner and a verifier that could support us on that journey. It ended up taking the whole team to get it around that and to pull that data together. But really, that beginning of it was really starting to see the demand from the senior levels within the industry, seeing this as an opportunity where we could kind of be a leader in that area. But it did end up becoming a whole team exercise, because really you end up needing that full data set that touches almost every part of the business, from our transport team to our procurement team, and going even all the way back through our supply chain, and being able to engage with our suppliers. And even our suppliers, it was the first time that they had been requested for this data as well. So it was a whole learning exercise for them.
Together. It sounds like a really collaborative exercise. No one person could be responsible for the whole thing.
No, I don't think so. There's way too much that goes on. When you say EPD, you just talk about the title, but as soon as you go underneath, and even just you flip the second page and you see the first table of results, it's 100% clear that you have so many stakeholders involved that it really has to be a team effort. And yes, someone can spearhead the efforts, but you have to have the buy-in for all the different areas of the business, effectively.
Yeah, and certainly I think from our perspective, additional beyond within the Forza team was finding the right partner to work with to guide us through that. So we ended up choosing a local consultancy that could kind of work with us fairly closely. They had a lot of experience around EPDs, but not within the timber door market. But they were really able to guide us and really work with us very closely, which is a big advantage, and that's specifically why we chose to go with them.
And having people like yourselves start that process, maybe you'll set the standard for the most suitable functional unit for a door. We've definitely seen for glazed partitions and doors, for example, a slightly different approach, for example, where one EPD will include both the door and the glazed partition, and then a competitor will do the partition and the door separately. And that lack of comparability is a real challenge, but I still feel we're like, at the beginning of this process where we've still got a big challenge just getting the data there in whatever functional unit and form and name of the document.
Absolutely. But certainly I think having a guide to an EPD must probably be the next step in terms of saying, okay, you receive this document, you open it up, there's lots of numbers, lots of ways of referring to the different numbers. Again, what is the functional unit? What is the actual reference unit? All of those nuances. We probably need more guidance and more explanation on what they actually are, and because certainly there isn't enough space within the document itself, because it's already so jam-packed of information. So almost some level of guidance from maybe some independent bodies that is effectively make it it's not biased against any specific manufacturer or technology, but just in general sort of a really good explanation. Okay, you receive this document, this is what you can expect to find in there, and this is how you can read the document. This is how you can then take the value and do the assessment that you need to do. I think it's probably something that, as like all the different industries that decide to go along with the journey of EPDs, we should probably start to think about doing that also, that exercise as well. And not just say, well, here you go, now run with it, and expecting that everybody knows and is 100% confidence with what the document actually means.
Because it was a consideration for us as well, very much aligned with that. It's kind of, where do we define and what do we include and not include within our EPD? As I said, we decided to separate the doors and frames, so aligned with how we operate our business. Sometimes our doors go into other people's frames, so it made sense. But also then, ironmongery. Do we include or not include the ironmongery? And
I can't remember, what did you decide to do?
We decided to exclude it. But we go down to the finer details of including the ironmongery install on site. So the use of hand tools, everything that's included in there. Just the ironmongery as the hardware would need to be layered in with our EPD, and then give that as a system perspective. So again, there's lots and lots of these small decisions that you have to make through the journey. and hopefully we've made the right decisions, or maybe there will be some more standardization as we go along as an industry in the built environment.
Yeah, and some of the ironmongery suppliers I know are starting to think about this. We've certainly seen some EPDs with door closers and things like that. So it does make it, like Matteo was saying, a Lego system of adding all those component parts together so that we can build up that picture of what tends up, we think of doors as being quite a simple product potentially, but it's quite complex when you start delving into the environmental impact and trying to put that into an EPD.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I know lots of the other manufacturers who I hope are listening to this and wanting to follow suit are going to be interested to know what it actually took in terms of boots on the ground, time invested by the team at Forza. What did that look like in terms of a time commitment?
Yeah, it was, as we've already said, it was over a year process for us. And really it was a lot of time from Colin, our ops director, and Kevin in the health and safety environment manager. But then it did, for those, it was, in some days it was you need to lock yourself in a room, particularly when you're getting to the late stage and you need to, read the full document and you're getting to the final details. It's, lock yourself in a room, no distractions and go through there. But even still, when we're just collecting the data, it went across the whole team. It was extensive. We tried to push as much back with our partner and our consultants as we could, but it's still a huge undertaking. But we saw it as an investment. Try and build as the right thing to do and where we see the industry going. But we also see that it will give us a competitive advantage going forward. Kind of continue to cement our position as a leader in the market. So it's an investment. It's not to be taken lightly. I couldn't give you a percentage or number of man hours, but it was certainly sat across the table from Kevin and kind of seeing his pile of paper for the EPDs just growing and growing month on month. So it was a lot of work from the team, but they should be very proud of what they've turned out.
Yeah, absolutely. You should be. We're so grateful, for you guys being pioneers in that respect.
One thing that I can probably add on, even though I wasn't directly involved in terms of the production, so I cannot really tell you the amount of time that it would take for like HVAC products, two things I can certainly share on this side. It gets better. Like the more you do, the more you understand what the process looks like, the more you work with a specific verifier, they also learn more about your product, and they have less questions because they may anticipate some of the obstacles, or they might already be proactive in the communication that you have with the verifier. And so we've seen it with some of our products. As I said, we started was 10 weeks and now some of them are becoming 8 weeks. And so progressively you see a bit of that time that is shrinking. I guess as with anything, the more you're familiar as well with the process, the easier it gets. So the first time when you start from scratch, certainly say, okay, where am I going to start from? There's so much. But then the more you get into the mindset, the more some of the data will remain consistent across the board, especially if your, for example, manufacturing locations are roughly the same. Everything that comes out of that factory will have some level of commonality. And so, you certainly progressively get better over time.
So doing it first off, that work's going to pay dividends to other EPDs that you might then look to produce.
Absolutely. As I said, we were doing 6 all at once, for the first time. So it was probably, maybe we made life difficult for ourselves, but it felt like the right way to kind of approach it, really thinking from our customers' perspective and, from your level of within the industry as well, then what's going to be most useful and, add the most value for everybody. So,
and all this data, there were no absolute deal breakers. There was nothing that you couldn't actually, with the time and effort and talking to the right people, obtain. There weren't any bits of data that were particularly difficult to get or you had to abandon.
No, I don't think so. I think some of our suppliers are, if you, within the business, we're quite a data-rich business. We do capture a lot of data. Pulling that together and getting it in the right format and being able to deliver it for our consultants and verifiers might have been where the challenge was. But when we started going into our supply chain and then asking them the questions and getting their buy-in to be able to give us this, that was probably took quite a bit of backwards and forwards, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I
But
can.
really valuable, and I'm sure we're the first, but I'm sure they'll get further questions as well from others in the industry.
So we should probably talk then about the actual results in the EPDs, because it's not just about producing them and them sitting on a shelf, it's about people then using them. And Matteo, you already kind of touched on this, about the complexities with reading and comparing. Looking just internally within your own business, what lessons have you taken from that EPD process in terms of the results that are in that report that you've then begun to act on in terms of making changes where you can affect change in terms of those environmental indicators?
Yeah. So from a more, let's say, personal, close experience point of view that I can share here, what we really learned is the true impact of refrigerants when it comes to the consideration in terms of carbon emissions and carbon footprint of our system. And it's not like we didn't know it, but the EPD helps you effectively quantify that effect. That is what one of the really powerful elements of this document is that you may have a bit of an educated guess in terms of, okay, what might be the difference between two different type of refrigerants or two different type of products, but the EPD effectively really grounds it in numbers, and so there's no more gray areas. It's very black and white in terms of what the differences are and what the advantages of going in one direction versus another might be. It's by no means is not 100% perfect and bulletproof EPDs, but it's still, because of that element of further verification, it does add a bit more weight and allows us to have those conversations and really try to drive even faster, let's say, the adoption of newer technology, better technology, and certainly from a refrigerant point of view, lower GWP refrigerant, which for us, considering what the European Union is wanting to do, it's the main way that we're going to go into the future, going toward more and lower GWP refrigerant. Because the factories, we are also trying to improve what we're doing from a factory point of view. There are very strict environmental targets that our factory have placed on themselves, effectively, to go to net zero. But considering again how the calculations around HVAC products are effectively being done at the moment, refrigerants still play a huge component into that final number. So yes, we can gain something by optimizing the factory processes, but still being able to further optimize and choose the best refrigerant in this case is really what will take us to the finishing line, I would say.
Do you think then, where you're making changes within the factory, which you're leading to the fact that they're not going to be over the whole life the most impactful in terms of positive changes that you can make, do you think you will update your EPDs once factory processes do improve?
Absolutely.
And will be giving
results? Because of course, every little thing that you change as from an EPD point of view is almost like a domino effect. So even the smallest change that you make can have a significant impact for the products that come out of the factories. In a sense, also, you have that, let's say, requalifications or update built into the EPDs, because you only have a limited shelf life of 5 years anyway.
5 years, yeah.
So if you want to renew that one, at some point you will rerun the number. And so if we rerun the number after 5 years and we made significant improvements for manufacturing, hopefully that will show. And so when you compare the 5 years ago versus the today, you can see even sort of more differences for the same products.
And Will, to you as well, what from going through that EPD process and the results that it was producing for you, have you made or started to think about making changes that could influence those results next time you update them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, having only just got these released and verified, then, we have until 2028 before they'll be re-verified, but that's a great timescale for us to implement some improvements and changes within the business, to therefore, keep continuously improvements. I think we've already touched on it, but, the creating the EPDs is not just a discrete task. For us, it's very much an ongoing journey. I think we're all getting better educated on, how we can minimize our impact on the environment, and we already have plans in place within Forza. So we're installing solar energy PV system on our factory buildings. we're going to look to swap into renewable energy suppliers. We are a large energy consumer, so that will trickle through that impact onto our EPD performance. We run our own fleet so that we ensure that our products are delivered to our customers in the same condition that they leave our factory. But that means we're also consuming a lot of diesel, and we've got that fleet out there. So, looking into the future, when's the right time that we convert those onto hydrogen or electric powered vehicles in the future? Even going back into our supply chain and product development decisions that we're making. It's now it was always where the quality of the product, the fire performance that would lead into our certification, but now this is another strand, and that environmental performance and how that would impact on our EPDs as well. Then that's really critical. And then you get all the way through to blue sky thinking, and could we do a full life cycle and bring products back, and could we recondition the door and then re-veneer it and then send it back out into the market for products for customers. That could be an exciting idea, but some way off. We'll continue to invest into it.
So that process has forced you to think more about circular economy and how that could work in your business.
Absolutely, yeah. I think like yourselves doing work around that whole reuse of certain products is an exciting area and something we'd like to be involved in.
Brilliant. And how much interest has there been? I know you said before you haven't really publicised it that widely yet, but do you feel like people are asking for the EPD, using the EPD on projects already?
Yeah, I think there is a commercial lead on this, and more than a regulatory lead, which is particularly in the UK market, and that seems to be very much driven from our perspective. What we're seeing, driven from main contractors down, which is exciting. And we now that we're starting to gently introduce this into the market, there seems to be being very well received and seen as a real positive for the Forza brand, and keeping us as a leader within our market. So I think as that knowledge continues to trickle down through the industry into the main contractors and below, then I think the value of that will just continue, and I think we'll all be more educated as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matteo, I think there was a more tangible commercial impact as a result of you guys releasing your EPDs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, similar to what we just said, it's all from. At the moment, it's from the very top. So main contractor, consultants, they're all over EPDs effectively. People that were not returning our calls, they're now calling us since we have this document available. But yes, it really opened up different conversations. We were able to, even within, for example, practices that we already had some connection with. Now we're talking with different people within those practices, because what we've seen as well is that a lot of, for example, consultants, they have new teams specifically dedicated to sustainability, and those are for us all new contacts that we normally would have not necessarily maybe talked with directly, because we also maybe didn't have a lot to share with them. But now that we have this tool, we can talk the same language with this team. We know that is what they want. We know how, and we are learning more and more how these flow in their workflow. And so really understanding, again, going back to what we were saying of how the documents are used, for us is very important to have this conversation to make sure that that we don't just make it a paper exercise, but we make sure that the data that we provide, it's really useful and it does work in the way that our customer, effectively our partners, want to use it. So the other element in terms of very tangible that we certainly observe, so we've made all our EPDs, they are freely available on our website. So we have a dedicated section on our website where you can just go in and download them. And even just the first day that we made them available, we've seen a few hundred clicks and downloads on the documents, which I don't think it has ever happened in the history of Daikin website. But yeah, so it's clear that the interest is there and people want the data. So I think it's really going to become a clear advantage moving into the future, or on the other end, a disadvantage if you're not able to provide that piece of information? I know that here in the UK, again, as Willie were saying, it's more commercially driven rather than legislation driven. But if I look in the past, many initiatives starts in a commercial world and then they translate into the legislative world. So it's not impossible to make the leap of saying, well, now it's a nice to have, but in 2, 3, 5 years, it's going to be a must have. Otherwise, you won't be considered. So I don't think it's impossible to effectively think that we might have the same situation like we've seen in France, where government effectively requires this type of certifications for new buildings, for example.
Brilliant. So let's move on to final thoughts. What I really wanted to get out of this conversation was the understanding amongst those who haven't started this journey or are thinking of starting this journey, or perhaps are sick of Zoe asking them to start their journey. What top pieces of advice would you give to those people who have yet to begin the EPD process about starting and embarking on that?
Yeah, I think, from, being able to look back over the process for us for the last year, I think it's a few key things, really getting the whole team buy-in, because for us, as we've touched on, it did touch on every part of the business, and pulling all that information together, it was making sure that everybody was aligned behind that and understood why then was really important. And I think finding the right consultants and verifiers really helped us on that, and they did great work, and we're local. They could really handhold for us to a certain extent. And then I think it's the fact that it's not just a single task. It's it's part of a journey, and then it's going to continue to evolve, and you're signing up for a continued commitment there. But I think it's where the built environment is going, and we all need to do our part in that.
Yeah, that's really good. And Matteo, how about you? Anything additional?
I'll say in similar fashion, and let's say to build on what Will just said, it's don't do it because it's fashionable, but do it for the right reason. And I think it's, unless you do it for the right reason, you will never get the actual buy-in from the different parts of the business. We talked about the amount of involvement that every single corner of the business needs to have in order to produce this document. So unless the right buy-in is in place, so people really understand why you want to get to the point of releasing an EPDs and what are the differences that you can show and the advantages that you can show by having the document, you will just encounter a lot of resistance. So people say, why are you asking me this question? Why you want that number? Or what do I need to do?
More admin that nobody needs. Yeah,
absolutely. So really try to go in with the right motivation and the right reason to effectively have a solid foundation to improve your business in a sense, and also be able to serve your market and your audience in a better way and in a more transparent way.
So we normally finish these conversations with one thing that you guys would like to change in the industry. And Matteo, perhaps if we could come to you first for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. So continuing on the, let's say, this discussion and conversation on EPDs, as I was mentioning before, it's a great tool. It's not yet bulletproof. There are some areas where effectively it doesn't truly allow consumers or whoever picks up this document to truly be able to directly compare, for example, different manufacturers or different technology together. For us, the reason for this is how this document treats refrigerant. So how it does account for the refrigerant which is in the system. If I can say, it's probably 1.5 thing that I would change, not just one, is making sure that finding a way to account for the full refrigerant charge of our system. Because at the moment, the value that are specified within the document only account for the amount of refrigerant that we as manufacturer will put into the machine at the factory stage. But as we know, system like VRVs, that portion likely represent maybe only 50% or maybe 2/3 of the final charge. So even from a point of view of someone that uses that document to make their evaluation and saying, am I actually eating my targets? You may be missing a chunk. and it could be a significant chunk that you're missing if you don't truly account for everything that goes into your building.
Yeah, and Will?
Yeah, a little bit aligned in some ways. I think ours is, particularly in the UK market, then as we've touched on already, it's the demand and the request and the kind of knowledge around EPDs is still sat at that kind of very top level within the industry. So, I'm talking at the design stage and then through into some of the main contractors is a bit patchy. I think being able to, that ongoing education and that feeding down through the rest of the industry into the main contractors, subcontractors, and then the other manufacturers that hopefully will embark on this journey. Then I think that ongoing education and a more joined up thought process will it's only got to be beneficial for the whole industry and the industry's environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the education piece. We certainly see amongst our supply chain people who really understand how to use these documents, who, when we're talking about value engineering, they'll be offering lower carbon alternatives and things. And then we'll have people who are asking for lower carbon options and they will look blankly and will need to explain what an EPD is from the off. So certainly a common theme here is not only producing the data, which we now feel like we're definitely all moving towards, but then actually using that data effectively will be really key.
Yeah.
Guys, it's been so insightful. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about your EPDs, producing them. I'm really hoping that that's going to be useful for other manufacturers hopefully listening to this, and hopefully it's tipped the balance in terms of getting them started on that journey. Hopefully we've affected a bit more change here. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this low carbon conversation. If you're particularly interested in EPDs, there was our very first podcast session with Alina, which covers this topic as well, which it might be interesting to dive into. She's covering the EPD aspect more from a designer's perspective. So that would also be a good one to have a look at. If you're interested in more low carbon conversations, then please subscribe on our YouTube channel, where there are plenty more exciting low carbon conversations to be had. Thank you.